Hi, I'm David Rios Ferreira. I'm a visual artist, curator, and museum professional. When I was first approached to consider an exhibition at Old Stone House, it was actually some of the initial meetings that we were having around my work and the kind of subject matter that I was interested in. And it came up in conversation around Baron von Steuben, who was a general that was brought in by George Washington to train the troops and prepare them for the Revolutionary War. It was noted in record that he identified as contemporary terms be queer or gay. His role wasn't one of a warrior or simply someone who was in the military, but he was a strategic thinker. It was really interesting to start to compile a list of individuals that we could find some record that they may have identified as queer, two-spirited, trans, non-binary, within the queer umbrella, but were strategic and crucial to their people in a number of ways. So the title of the exhibition is Angelic, Troublemakers, Tactical Deviants. Angelic troublemakers is actually a term that Bayard Rustin used when referring to the need for people to make movements within their community. He simply said communities need angelic troublemakers. And what I loved about that term was that sort of duality, angels being secret and subtle and also ephemeral, but then troublemakers being really grounded and impactful. But then I wanted to get at some of the other individuals that I was being introduced to in my research, Bayard being one of them, he was a strategic planner. He wasn't one to be on the pulpit. There's the people who are on the soapbox, and then there's people making sure the soapbox exists and that it's there. Tactical deviants came about by thinking about, well, they were strategic in their, in making sure their people were free or empowering their communities, but potentially at their time, the word, this term deviant, or this term, I wanted to pull out the fact that they're still recognized as being other. Even with those two sets of titles within the title, there's some dualities, and that sort of mirrors a lot of what I do in my work. So my practice always involves appropriating images from a variety of sources. So they might be from etchings from historical references, and then cartoons and coloring books and animation. I'm pulling from images that were made by people, various people, and how they carry with that an energy, and what they represent also carries a history. With all the sources being so complex and coming from various places, from the most volatile to the most simplistic and family friendly, that's how complex we are. So I'm interested in that complexity, and with the figures that are in this exhibition, I consider them unportraits, or this idea of the unportrait, which is not a clear depiction of the figure or the subject, but pulling in all the pieces that through word association, history, research, start to lay out this idea that about how they represented themselves, but also how they might represent a people. So for a long time, I thought I was going to be a Disney animator. As early as I could remember, I was drawing since I was 3. So that was part of me for a really long time. And then as I grew up and started to go into different art programs and eventually going to college, this idea of using that medium to talk about things that I was really concerned with or things I was really interested in exploring is where I moved into a more contemporary art practice. But I still really love that aesthetic, but also know that aesthetic from various companies and production firms that create these children's media, that there's a complexity and issues around how they appropriate their own imagery and how they appropriate their own narratives and stories. A lot of my work, I will include pirate ship, and it started off from looking at children's media and films like Peter Pan that had pirate ships, and then I started to unearth more and more images around that and saw so many layers around the history of that form and how it was this, obviously we think of it as historically as these merchant ships, but it was the same ships that were used to bring slaves from West Africa into the Caribbean, where my family's from, and all the layers around this one object. So as I'm looking for images, I might start off with what I call an anchor. So thinking about a place or a person and start to do this Google search, starting with Google, even YouTube, and then the algorithm suggests something or introduces something that I'm like, how is this related? Or where did this come from? I have to be careful about where my source material is coming from, but also I'm relaxing that restriction as well to think about, well, how's the world understanding this word or this person or this landscape from this very digital, image accessible world we're in. I'm settled with a little bit of unease around. There was the research I could find, and then there was plenty I couldn't find. And I think about specific figures like Lawson or Tish, indigenous individuals who, when you search for portraits of them, you find a variety that are claiming a portrait that other websites are claiming under other names, and so it becomes this inconsistent source of, well, where is the truth? Which is where the unportraits are really interesting to me. This idea, like, are we looking for truth, or are we looking for meaning and something a little deeper? The process of starting my drawings in general begins with gathering all my reference images. I'm working on my iPad, and through a series of drawing apps will piece all these different lines together, and I build out a composition, or I build out a subject or a landscape that way. But then sometimes I miss the pencil. What I'll do is piece all my reference images together. Maybe I print them out at different scales. I'm Xeroxing them at various sizes, and we use a light box to piece together a composition through tracing. In both cases, I very much think of them as collage. And once I feel like the composition is at one stage, and I'm either projecting them or printing them large scale and tracing them again, using a variety of markers, paint markers, gouache. It's like at each stage I'm further abstracting the subject that I'm looking to explore. So in some cases, the line drawing could be very recognizable who I'm thinking about or trying to depict. And then at other times, once it gets to the stage in which I've either blown it up or redrawn it through marker, I kind of like this idea of other variables that I can't control start to take over and start to further abstract. It's an ongoing process of finding and losing. So I'm like losing things, I'm burying things with whole other sheets of paper, or I'm burying them with different colors, and then realize I need to pull it back out. And at some point I have to stop. At some point I got to find that moment where I feel like what happens as a whole speaks to the figure that I've been thinking about and meditating about. I was having a concern around focusing on not doing so much, in that I typically don't explore necessarily Western or European figures and subjects. He kind of set something in motion. Like, he was one of many who set something in motion. And so what could that look like? And then, well, did everything he helped set forth, are we all benefiting from that history? Are we all benefiting from, what was won in that war? And so that's where I start to mix in other references in that larger work, because I was trying to think about, how do I identify with this figure? And for all the figures, actually, it was thinking about my own queer identity and this shared history I have with all these figures. We're not a monolithic people. Obviously, we're coming from so many different cultures. In a way, we're all connected through how our identities are connected. As much as I'm interested in history, I'm also interested in how history has an impact on our present and on our future. And this stems a lot from my own Caribbean upbringing, of how we view time and how we believe that there are people who have passed or who are no longer with us that are still in our present and still with us. And there's also spiritual practice of communicating with our ancestors and helping them guide us to make real decisions that are very much related to the everyday part of our lives. There was this element I've wanted to have where there was some kind of ripple or effect that each drawing had, like a wave of some kind, whether it's the paint or it's the graphite smudged across the surface. And they all sort of speak to that same. I was trying to create a shared language around all the drawings, regardless of what medium I was using, in order to speak to that level of effect that is intangible about, so we have these figures leaving behind an impact that we really can't feel or see, but are certainly impacted and affected by. I can't say that I've settled on a singular statement around all the various ways these figures represent a queer identity, but I think what I was interested with all these figures and subjects, well, how do these people live out their lives without fear, without persecution? These are figures that were honored in their communities, But where does love and friendship and family fit into that? I hope that as people walk through the exhibition that maybe they dive into their own research around these figures or around figures like them. A lot of my work, however historically referenced or like even mechanically drawn in some cases, I'm still thinking about the human. Like how does this history impact me? It affects us, and it's in the air. It's something you can't see, but it does affect us. But what would I say to a burgeoning artist? You're going to find a way to do what you want to do. You're always going to find it. For those who are unsure if they'll be able to continue to do their art because they took on a job or find ways to survive in the city, you're going to make art regardless of where you are. Yeah, you're going to do it no matter what, and you're going to find a way to do it.